everyone, Miss Parker here with First Chapter Fridays. Today we're going to take a look at I Hunt Killers by Barry Lyga. This book is about Jasper Dent, and he's a likable teenager. He's also the son of the world's most infamous serial killer. And for dear old dad, Take Your Son to Work Day was year round. Now there are bodies piling up in Lobo's Nod, and Jazz is the prime suspect. So let's take a look at the first chapter of I Hunt Killers. By the time Jazz got to the field outside town, the yellow police tape was everywhere, strung from stake to stake in a sort of drunken, off-kilter hexagon. The field was thick with cops, state troopers in their khakis, a cluster of deputies in their blues, and even a crime scene tech in jeans and a windbreaker. That last one really impressed Jazz. The town of Lobo's Nod was too small for its own official crime scene unit, so usually the deputies handled evidence collection at the scene. The fact that they'd actually called a real live tech from 2 towns over, and on a Sunday morning no less, meant that they were taking this seriously. Some of the deputies were down on all fours, heads down, and Jazz was amused to see a guy with a metal detector just outside the crime scene tape, slowly pacing back and forth. One of the stadies had a cheap little digital video camera and was carefully pacing the perimeter of the scene. And riding herd over all of it was Sheriff G. William Tanner, standing off to one side, fist planted on his love handles, watching as his command scurried around him at his bidding. Jasper Jazz Dent wasn't about to let the cops see him. He belly crawled the last 15 yards through underbrush and tall grass, patiently making his way to a good vantage point. This part of the old Harrison farm had once been endless rows of soybean plants. It was now nothing but old, bent and broken stalks, weeds, cattails, and scrub. Perfect cover, really. From here, Jazz could make out the entirety of the crime scene, helpfully demicarded by the yellow tape. "What have we here?" Jazz muttered to himself as the videographer, about 10 feet from the body, suddenly shouted out. Jazz was far enough away that he couldn't make out the words, but he knew it was something significant because everyone immediately turned in that direction and another deputy rushed over. Jazz went for his binoculars. He owned 3 different pairs, each for different purposes, each a gift from his father, who had a very specific reason for giving them to his son. Jazz tried not to think about those reasons. For now, he was just happy that he had brought this particular set of binocs. They were Steiner 8x30 binoculars, waterproof, rubberized grip, weighted just a tad over a pound. But the real selling point was the blue-tinted objective lenses, which reduced glare and reflection to almost nil. That meant the enemy, or for example, a group of cops just 20 yards away, wouldn't catch a glimpse of the sun bouncing off the glass and haul you out of the woods. Dust and assorted leftover plant pollens tickled Jazz's nose, and he caught himself just before he sneezed. "When you're prospecting," dear old dad had told him, "you gotta be real quiet, see? Most people have got little noisy habits they never think of. You can't do them things, Jasper. You just have to be totally quiet, dead quiet." He hated most things about dear old dad, but what he hated most was that dear old dad was pretty much always right. He zoomed in on the stady with the video camera, but the others were crowding around him, making it impossible for them to see what everyone was so excited about. Jazz watched as one of them held up a plastic evidence bag, but before he could adjust to focus on the bag, the cop brought his arm down and the bag vanished behind his thigh. "Someone found some evidence," Jazz chanted under his breath, then bit his bottom lip. "Most of these guys, they want to get caught," dear old dad had said on more than one occasion. "You understand what I'm saying? I'm saying most of the time they get caught because they want it, not because anyone figures them out, not because anyone outthinks them." Jazz wasn't doing anything wrong, lying out here on his belly watching the police process the crime scene, but getting caught would probably mean being taken away and possibly a stern lecture from G. William, and he didn't want that. He'd been at home earlier that morning, his bedroom door shut tight against one of his grandmother's periodic rants. They'd been getting worse and more frequent. When the police scanner had soberly announced a code 2213, an abandoned body had been found. Jazz had grabbed his pack, already stocked with everything he needed for a stakeout, and climbed down the drain pipe outside of his window. No point in running into Grandma in the hallway and being delayed by her raving. A body was nothing new in Lobo's Nod. The last time bodies had turned up, Jazz's life had turned upside down, and it still hadn't righted itself. Even though it had been years since those days, and everyone had packed that time away, there were still times when Jazz feared his life would never be right side up again. As the cops clustered around William G., Jazz refocused on the body. As best as he could tell from so far away, there was little in the way of serious trauma. No obvious knife or gunshot wounds, for example. Nothing major jumped out at him, but he didn't exactly have the best vantage point. He was reasonably certain of two things. It was a woman, and she was naked. Naked made sense. Naked bodies were tougher to identify. Clothes told you all sorts of things about a victim. Once you identified the victim, you were one step closer to identifying who made that person a victim. Anything that slows them down, even if it's just by a few minutes, is a good thing, Jasper. You want them nice and slow like a turtle, slow like ketchup. Through the binocs, he watched as G. William mopped sweat from his forehead with a checkered handkerchief. Jazz knew from experience and observation that the handkerchief had been embroidered GWT years ago by the sheriff's late wife. G. William had dozens of the snot rags, carefully laundered and cared for. He was the only man in town, probably the only man alive, who had handkerchiefs professionally dry cleaned. The sheriff was a good guy. He came across as sort of a parody of himself when you first met him, but underneath that barbecue-infused gut and floppy dishwasher-colored mustache, he was some serious law enforcement genius, as Jazz knew from personal experience. Tanner ran the entire county sheriff's department from his office in Lobo's Nod, and he earned the respect of not just the county but the entire state. Heck, the Stadies didn't send a guy out to videotape a field for just anyone. Tanner had pull. Jazz swept his binocs over a bit and caught a glimpse of the evidence bag as G. William held it up in the sunshine. For a heart-stopping instant, he was sure what he saw in the bag couldn't be for real. But the sheriff's stance gave Jazz a perfect binocular-enhanced view of what it held. And that made Jazz's heart pound so hard he thought Tanner would hear it from where he stood. A body in a field was one thing. It happened. A drifter, a runaway, whatever. But this portended something new, something big. And Jazz had a sinking feeling that people would be looking at him with accusation in their eyes. Only a matter of time, they would say. Had to happen sooner or later, they would say. So he started running down possible alibis. From the relatively pristine condition of the body, he was comfortable guessing the woman had been killed sometimes in the past 6 hours. He had been home in bed all night with Grandma, the only other person in the house. Not the world's most reliable witness. Connie would lie for him if necessary. This thought went through his mind for a fleeting second, but was interrupted almost immediately by the sound of a vehicle trundling up the grade. The field was almost level, but not entirely. While it was flat where the body had been found, it sloped down about 100 yards to the south and also climbed a bit more steeply, maybe twice as far north. The vehicle coming up the road from the south was a beat-up Ford station wagon from back when they used to put lead in gasoline. Lobo's Nod medical examiner was stenciled professionally, if a bit pretentiously, on the door. That meant, sure enough, as Jazz watched, 2 cops approached the corpse with a body bag hanging limp between them. The preliminary crime scene examination was done. Jazz watched as a tech carefully wrapped the corpse's head. Then they did the same to the hands and feet. Always check the hands and feet, Daryl's dad whispered from the past. And the mouths and the ears. You'd be surprised what gets left behind. He blinked away the voice and watched them maneuver the dead woman into the bag and zip it shut. As he focused on the struggle with the body bag, something caught his attention from the corner of his eye. He tried to ignore it. It was the kind of thing he didn't really want to notice, but he couldn't help it. Once he'd seen it, it was something he it wasn't something he could just unsee. There was one cop in particular standing off to the side, not so far from the body that anyone would doubt that he was a part of the crime scene, but far enough that no one asked for his help with anything. He just stood there, and to anybody else observing, this cop would appear to be keeping out of the way, trying not to interfere. Jazz thought he knew all of Lobo's Nod cops on site, and even most of the guys from the surrounding towns. This guy was wearing a Lobo's Nod uniform, but he was a stranger, and he was ready. That was the only way Jazz could describe it. Ready, vulnerable, easy. He was fidgeting just a bit, 2 fingers on his left hand idly toiling with a rough patch of scuffed leather on his gun belt near the canister of mace. He would be easy to take down, despite his training, despite his gun and his mace and his baton. Jazz could more than imagine doing so. He could see it right through the binoculars as if it were happening. Jazz could read people. It wasn't something he worked at. It was just as natural as breathing. It was as ordinary as reading a billboard on the highway. You don't really think about the billboard. You just notice it, and your brain processes it, and that's it. He closed his eyes for a long moment and tried to think of Connie, of the 2 of them tangled together at the hideout, tried to think of playing basketball with Howie, tried to think of his mother, of the last thing he could remember about her before he disappeared, tried to think of anything other than how easy it would be to approach this cop, put him at ease, seduce him into compliancy, and then go for the belt, the mace, the nightstick, the gun. It would be so easy. It was so easy. Jazz opened his eyes. The body was in the station wagon. Even from a distance, he heard the door slam. Jazz wiped sweat from his forehead. G. William was picking his way carefully down the grade toward the road and his car. The rest of the cops were staying on scene for now. The evidence bag. Jazz couldn't stop thinking about it, about what he'd seen inside it, actually. A finger. A severed human finger. So if you'd like to keep reading and find out what happens in I Hunt Killers, you can check that out through our ebook access, and you can find more information about that in the link below.